We're going on air here and we're live for Habitat Issue Triage for November 6th. Let's start off with this one that we punted on last week. This is the one I wanted to get Ian's eyes on. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. So this is based off a conversation that I think was happening out in the forums and maybe also partially in Slack. So in like implementation details aside, basically the idea was instead of having an export that only allowed you to like right now, if you want to do binds between two services, you have to use an export for the system's IP address, right? So the idea here was that right now we have a bug that exists somewhere in the supervisor where that system IP address sometimes gets reported as localhost, which is there should be an open issue for it. The problem then being that like you could have two services that are binding, one of which is like trying to reach out to a secondary service, and it's just hitting localhost because it can't find the appropriate IP address. So the idea here was like this user, I think, only initially requested this just because they were trying to get around that bug. But also, you know, in further kind of conversation, the discussion about having an export that is the actual fully qualified domain name might be practical or might be useful in some regard. Now, I don't know how we would accomplish that because there's lots of ways that people configure DNS and lots of ways that people configure host names. And so like getting a real fully qualified domain name could be kind of hard, especially if we're not like using the system IP address to make a DNS query to like get the host name back or whatever. So I don't really know what it would look like implementation wise, but it seemed like an interesting idea. I'm not like super passionate either way about doing it or not doing it personally, but that's the context. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts or feelings on that.
I'm struggling to see that it would have a great deal of practical value other than looking pretty.
And I think that's a totally fair critique.
So I'm putting my like chef project hat back on for a second, because there is the library in Chef called Ohio, which allows you to like inspect system things, and there's plugins that allow you to get more information. And I can remember that getting your IP addresses from your networking stack and like the FQDN, like they remain to be like the hard problems, although they're about as solved as I've ever seen anything. So my guess is like if we were to go down that road, we'd likely, or if I was tasked with that, I'd be basically going right back to that Ohio code base to figure out what is the prior art and like what's the best that that people have been able to get on that. My guess though is even if we were able to figure it out, there would probably be, for the feature to be like nice and well rounded, we'd probably want the ability for a user or an operator to like inject that in as well, to say like, yeah, despite what the system tells you, I'm going to tell you that the FQDN is actually this, and I know that because of, I don't know, maybe it's on the other side of a NAT or something like that. So as long as like the user could superimpose their will back on the supervisor, then yeah, it would, that would probably make it like the fully fleshed out thing in my mind. Like without that, I think we'd be left with, like the system's probably going to be more wrong than right, potentially.
For sure.
Yeah. If there's an issue where sometimes we're getting the IP and sometimes we're getting localhost, then that by itself seems like something that we should fix.
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Despite this.
Yeah, whether or not this is accepted, I think that's like an important bug. It's listed there. I think it's 5079 is the issue number.
Okay.
So, and I don't really know what all that. It's been a minute since I opened this, so.
I will say, unless the logic has changed, the way that we are figuring that out, or the supervisor is a little hilarious, and it often works, but it's not as good as it probably could be. And again, back to that idea, like maybe there needs to be a way in some future incarnation that you could configure the supervisor to say, this is my system one. I mean, you can do it on the command line right now, but maybe that's good enough.
Something configurable might not be bad, even especially in a case where you've got like right now, if we do our best to determine what the appropriate IP is for that sys IP, but like if you're in bare metal and you're running something that's got 3 NICs on it, and you've got that thing on 3 different subnets, like there's no guarantee that we're going to get the right one.
Effectively, we're crafting like a DNS packet, and without sending it out, we're sort of, the byproduct is we're kind of figuring out what likely your egress NIC is, and then getting the primary IP on that. So it's like, it's not the best, but that's kind of the trick right now.
Yeah, so I mean, like I don't know if there's any, like, I can't think of any specific case where it's really important that you have a DNS address over an IP, except for maybe in the case where if you're like in an environment where even that, I was like, maybe if you're in an environment where you're like 100% IPv6, like maybe having a DNS entry would be good in that situation.
I don't think we work on IPv6 right now. Anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess the main thing is if there was some need to advertise something, or to be able to pull it out by service discovery in order to make an HTTP request that needed a specific virtual host, then that would be a case where you need to advertise that. But then you're back into the rabbit warren of making sure that the reverse DNS points to the correct name for the virtual host you want to call, and that's anyone's guess.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I don't know if we want to just vote on up or down on it. It seems like talking with the user who reported, who requested that I open this issue. What he had to say was just effectively that, like, if that bug were solved, there wouldn't be a need for this. And there were a couple other people who were like, well, I can think of some corner case, and I was like, never heard of these things that you're suggesting, but maybe could happen. So my initial inclination is to just close this as won't, like, for now, and then if it comes back up again once we've solved the bug, then maybe we'd reopen it.
Yeah, I'm kind of inclined to do the same thing.
+1 from me.
All right. Builder aggressively logs out.
It does.
Well, yeah, so I mean, it's a good issue. We have a session, auth session, that is not persisted. It's in cache, so if you have a service restart, if you, for some reason, whatever, then you get logged out and you can log back in. I think it is annoying behavior when it happens, so I would definitely accept this and look for a solution. Maybe we do start doing that persistence again.
Yep, I would agree. Seems like something that we can take care of. going to say it's less easy, though. All right.
I haven't followed up on this, but I had a suspicion what the problem was.
Looks like an oversight that we should just fix.
So it basically comes down to the subcommand is technically Docker, like export Docker is the subcommand, and all the arguments are on there.
Yeah.
And because of the position that this person had in the arguments, that's why the parser was very confused. And those options aren't necessarily common, or they're certainly not set up as common right now. So I guess we haven't heard back, but my guess is that is it. And there might be a way we could make that clear in the documentation, perhaps.
I'm all for making that clear in the documentation.
Actually, is this slightly different? Because he's looking at the channel that's coming in from the services endpoint, which would be that'd be like the channel that you would be pulling updates from, like as a running service, whereas the arguments here are for the export are driving what package release actually gets baked into the export. So while I think there is a which part of the command do the arguments apply to question, it seems like that's where the initial confusion might be coming from.
Yeah, that's possible. And I bet we probably don't call that out as clearly as we could in the documentation, that like this command effectively bakes you an artifact, but some of these decisions about what the supervisor does at runtime when you invoke it, most of those decisions are delayed until you run it, which means when you run that container, you're going to want to set the channel to update on, or the alternate builder URL. Like, we're not baking those into the image, and that probably could be made clearer. I could see people getting potentially confused, misled, or other. And that probably applies to all those exporters right now. Unless we've deviated from that, I think that is probably the behavior we've done mostly across the board, is try not to bake in the expectations of how you're going to run the thing if possible, because that allows that one artifact to be maximally portable. But it also means you can't bake in those assumptions really, or we don't really have a good mechanism for that if that's what you wanted.
The thing is, if you look at HAB package export help, it's not what we're saying. So that's one other thing to consider.
Yeah, that's right. We could make that particular subcommand help clear. That one is doing some interesting things, like the Docker, the word that comes after that is most likely going to download a Habitat package which has the exporter functionality. So we could pay special attention to the Hab package export help dialog to say, this is what these things are going to do. The hard thing is, at the moment, we could probably give you a list of like, here's the ones we know about, but we've talked about the idea of, someday probably these exporters seem like plugins, so perhaps more of a formal plugin system might help discovery and pluggability and knowing what's out there. And so we may have some work around that, but like step one is we could probably make our documentation a bit easier to help in those situations.
Yep. Can I sign it to you, Fletcher?
Sure.
Will you punt it if you don't want to take it on?
Yeah, no, that's all right. I think I left it with a question or two, so it means that like either that was the right advice or I misunderstood the question. Either way, hopefully feedback will help from there.
All right. I swear there was another issue there, but maybe it disappeared while we were doing this. I guess that's it. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Nice and quick.
Bye for now.
Thank you.